Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Winston Churchill, in his memoir of the First World War, which he called The World Crisis, has a memorable scene which takes place on the 28th of June 1914. The cabinet is meeting at 10 Downing Street, discussing once more the very difficult problems of Ireland. And as Churchill famously writes, we were trolling around the muddy byways of Fermanagh and Tyrone when somebody handed a note saying that an Austrian Archduke had been murdered in Sarajevo. This, of course, was the event that led to the First World War. And Churchill's passage has stayed in my mind because it often suggests that we are dealing with a smaller crisis so attentively that we miss a much bigger crisis, which is suddenly looming in the background and like a snake is going to raise up its head and bite us. And this week, the outbreak of fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan has reminded us of the so-called frozen conflicts in Europe, where it's not so much the conflicts which are frozen, tragically, but rather the negotiations. And out of nowhere, we've suddenly had a week of fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan that's spreading beyond the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh into Armenian cities and Azeri cities, and which threatens to become an all-out war between these two countries. Now, this so-called frozen conflict is part of four in the former Soviet Union. There's the Russian occupation of Georgian land in the shape of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. There is the Russian incursion since 2014 into the Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, and the Russian military occupation of part of Moldova, the so-called area of Transnistria as well. And it's doubly wrong to call these conflicts frozen, because the one, for example, in Nagorno-Karabakh caused 30,000 dead when it broke out in 1991, and the one in Ukraine has created 13,000 victims so far, without mentioning all of the wounded and all of the internally displaced persons. Now, the international community has not been, thank God, totally idle. For example, it has refused to recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea. It has refused to recognize as independent states Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And it certainly hasn't encouraged the Armenians to move towards annexing Nagorno-Karabakh. And certain negotiation groups like the Minsk Group, the Normandy Forum, the Trilateral Group have been set up to try to mediate, but so far all without success. What has gone wrong? Well, in the first place, we've had political leaders who have simply been unwilling to compromise. We have not had a Prime Minister Tsipras of Greece or a Prime Minister Zaev of Macedonia who have been willing to bury the hatchet. Number two, Russia has often wanted to play, on the one hand, the arsonist, stoking up the conflict, and on the other hand, be the neutral peacemaker, and you can't have it both ways. Also, Georgia, Ukraine, countries which find their territories occupied, have had to divert very scarce resources into military budgets at the expense of health, education, and social reconstruction. Often, it's been convenient for Russia, but also for people in the West too, to use these frozen conflicts, for example, in Georgia and Ukraine, as an alibi not to move forward on their incorporation one day into NATO. And of course, as we've seen with Azerbaijan in the last couple of days, as these conflicts are unresolved, as people can't go home, as territories remain occupied by foreign powers, frustration builds up and leaders then become more willing to take matters into their own hands, as President Saakashvili did in Georgia in 2008 and as President Aliyev in Azerbaijan seems willing to do at the moment. So what can the international community do to freeze the conflicts and unfreeze the peace talks and the negotiations? Well, in the first place, a better job of reading the early warning signs. There have been several instances of shelling, of ceasefire violations between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which frankly we should have picked up without waiting for full-scale hostilities to break out. Number two, let's get the US back into the game. The US is, after all, part of the Minsk Group with Russia and France dealing with the Nagorno Nagorno-Karabakh problem. As I said in my Keeping an Eye last week, if the US is an actor, it gives additional heft to EU diplomacy. Where Russia is willing to act constructively, and on Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia has also been calling for a ceasefire and talks between the parties, contrary to Ukraine, where Russia is often interfering. Let's therefore work constructively with Russia to bring about a ceasefire. Let's get tough on the leaders too. To desist from violence. Let's not supply them any more arms and weapons. Let's also get them to commit to peace plans where their obligations are very clearly spelt out. For example, one thing that's bedeviled Ukraine is that the implementation of the peace plan is so vague that Ukraine is always saying that Russia has to take the first step, and Russia is always saying that Ukraine has to take the first step, and we get nowhere at all. These frozen conflicts are reminders, first of all, that violence can always break out in Europe when we are asleep at the wheel, but secondly, that we have lots of instruments that we're not bringing into play to actually stop those conflicts and find a viable way ahead. Thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and I look forward to engaging with you this time once again next week. Bye for now.